I would like to invite to the stage our keynote speaker. We've got Professor Fawn from St. Andrews University, who is well-versed in dynamics of Central Europe. He's quite, I guess, knowledgeable on all 4 countries here of the Visegrad group, and his book is coming out, or has come out perhaps already. He has to give us all the details, but he does focus on regionalism, and I look forward to his remarks. And if you'd like to have some questions, I will ask from the audience, and he'll be hopefully willing to answer and engage in discussion. So I look forward to his talk. Please, Rick.
Thank you very much, Alica. I imagine that in settings like this, you hear speakers say how honored they are to speak, and I am very much deeply honored to be here. I'm also intimidated to be addressing an august group of practitioners, of scholars of multilateralism. And when we think about multilateralism, as we already have this morning, we might want to think on the Deputy Foreign Minister's comments about this great palace both being policy and thinking. And I would also recall that multilateralism sometimes comes to an end. And multilateralism came to an end in this very distinct hall in 1991. So I'm very, very deeply honored to be here with you. I come from the University of St. Andrews. If you'd indulge me, as I've put on the slide, St. Andrews is in Scotland, still in the UK, which is still in the European Union. And St. Andrews, though it has something of a curious geographical location, has a couple of very strong connections to Central Europe, including a Czech Hussite who made his way there, and unfortunately, as was the tradition, was burnt at the stake. And more recently, it was the headquarters for the Polish military, not the political government in exile, but the military government in exile during the Second World War. So I'm very privileged, I feel, to speak to you. Part of the logic of what I'm going to say comes from having done a study on regionalism, which was published by Cambridge about 10 years ago, I'm shocked to say. Another book on the OSCE and the Council of Europe, really asking the question how normative organizations, ones that don't have big money, that don't have coercive instruments, deal with recalcitrant members, members who are taking away from their institutions. And yes, you are right. If it were a better world, the book that our organizer kindly mentioned would be finished now. It's not, but it is a study on Visegrad. So what I'll attempt to do in a few minutes is to give some extractions from the Visegrad experience and to generalize them for multilateralism. I think this is something of a big undertaking, so I look forward to hearing from you on this. So first, a moment of what we could call scene setting. I think Visegrad is remarkable. It came essentially from nothing, and it endures. Let's not take that for granted. It is a legitimate, I think we're probably convinced by virtue of being here, it's a legitimate subject of study. And in fact, I would go further by virtue of this talk to say that it has some generalizable examples, lessons for multilateralism. And just if we spend a couple of seconds, I'm sure I would kill you on a Monday morning if, as an academic, I ran through a long list of journal titles. Are you agreed? I won't do that. But just as name recognition, it is striking how Visegrad, which of course is not a geographic area, it's not Nordic Europe, for example. It's not a language group like Scandinavia. It is not immediately recognizable, other than by itself, has now such traction that it's a term used in virtually every field of study. How do we do multilateralism? Visegrad, I think, had a very inauspicious start, a tough start. It actually tried to start before it really started. It started in 1990, not 1991. At a meeting, I think, that was full of inspiration, but which was, can I say it? I'm not a diplomat, so I can speak more bluntly, a disaster. The starting point was a disaster. And it took some time, it took greater organization, it probably took major impulses in the pan-European area, including changes, negative changes, in the Soviet Union, to jumpstart the process, but it did. And multilateralism, I think, needs experimentation. It has to be willing to try, and to try again. It has to ignore failures. Visegrad has had a number of failures in its history. It's had a lot of disruption. There's a great deal of debate, perhaps not intrinsically of interest to us right now, this morning, but a lot of debate as to how many times it's died, or how long it was in a vegetative state. And yet, now, I would say it's in a dynamic and robust state. So endure. Look for something big. In a way, Visegrad was very fortunate that it was a product of and dealing with a reordering moment in history. Obviously, the end of the Cold War and the security vacuum that Central Europe found itself in. And let's not forget it, the tremendous resistance of the EC at the time and NATO to open their doors. We take that for granted now, as the Deputy Minister mentioned, the many, many years of Euro-Atlantic membership. That was not a given in the 1990s. And then the question of what would happen in the still existing Soviet Union. And to do that, multilateral organizations have to be outspoken. And Visegrad, in many regards, was very successful in doing that, not least by harnessing tremendous personalities in the region. And in the big thinking, I think it remarkably did take on big issues. It took on what now is the Euro-Atlantic structures. It took on the reordering of Europe. And to me, when one looks at larger histories now of our post-Cold War Europe, Visegrad should have a significant place in that. And certainly retrospectively, perhaps more than is the case, diplomats of the region accredit Visegrad with tremendous importance in opening NATO and EU doors. So it has changed large dynamics. Visegrad has always been open. I will come back to that dynamic as well, speaking to others. What was striking for me was that within a year and a half, this non-existent entity had been, by name, had become an interlocutor of the European community. Already in 91, certainly through 1992, Visegrad was recognized by name, was in statements, and even though bilateral agreements were signed, the then three countries, as Visegrad, were interlocutors with the European community. A lot of name branding that comes from that. In 1994, in a period when it seems that Visegrad starts to die, President Bill Clinton, playing the saxophone here in Prague, addressed the Visegrad group. The official US documents are about the Visegrad group. So thinking big and name recognition with that. Another suggestion, don't worry about competitors. This is a region that is full of interstate formations. And in the 1990s, there was a tremendous amount of competition. Lots of organizations, many of which continue today, that had sprung up because of the reordering time that it was. So the Council of the Baltic Sea States, Black Sea Economic Organization, what became the Central European Initiative, and many, many more. Don't worry. If there is logic, if there's purpose to the organization, it can and should endure. And I think Visegrad is a success story in those terms. It has to have, though, content and purpose, and we'll come to some of that. One of the things an organization can do is to try to have offspring. And when Visegrad seemed dead through the 1990s, I would argue that it actually lived. It lived through offspring. One of Visegrad's major achievements, just before it was about to die, was to launch the Central European Free Trade Agreement, CEFTA. CEFTA endured through the 1990s. It endures in another guise now. And it expanded in its membership. So even though you could have death on one hand, you could have rebirth on the other. So diversification within the organization. And then also within the organization itself, Visegrad, especially from the later 90s onwards, instigated activities at virtually every ministerial level, in every sector, so that Visegrad had life across the 4 ministries of each country, so that there were dynamics in sectoral activities, irrespective of political activities at the highest level. And this kind of success allowed for imitation. Part of the way that we could judge Visegrad's success is that others looked upon it, both individual countries and other formations. Visegrad gave birth to the IVF, forgive that pun, the International Visegrad Fund, not something else. And the fund, of which I'll speak briefly later, is often said to be the only institution of Visegrad. That is, in my view, rather misleading. But nonetheless, this is another child of Visegrad. And the International Visegrad Fund not only promotes activities within the region, but brings the region and its experience, its role model benefit to other regions. And that includes particularly the Western Balkans, which have been supported and of their own accord also are now, in a positive sense, mimicking Visegrad activities. And in a tough neighborhood that is the Eastern Partnership, the conflict-ridden three Caucasus states, which go in very different geopolitical directions, as well as Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine, Visegrad and its activities and its fund have significant appeal and traction. Don't worry too much about societal name recognition. I have the benefit of teaching students who have the highest entry requirements to universities. They're intrinsically interested in international relations. They don't know, I love them, don't be mistaken. They don't know major multilateral institutions. They tend to know the ones that have aircraft and that fly and do things. So the OECD, not a chance. The OSCE, of which they are usually participating state citizens, very, very little. Name recognition in society doesn't necessarily matter, although I think we like it. And I would make some suggestions as to how we do that. And those suggestions are based on what Visegrad does. And Visegrad is a small organization, very limited resourcing, financial resourcing, and yet I would argue very good societal traction. One of the ways to do it, it's not product placement, talking about academics. However, I think this is a fantastic way of building name recognition if an IO wants it. NATO, for example, NATO fellowships, but that's expensive and on a very, I think, limited basis, having looked at the program over a couple of decades. Do something that funds think tanks, academics in a region and outside a region. They are, if you want, force maximizers. They generate materials, they generate name recognition, and they build networks and they attract additional attention. And I think what has been done in this region through the Visegrad networks, the think tanks, the fellowships, is actually really quite remarkable and has increased both within the region and more widely the name recognition. So if a multilateral organization, institutions want such, this is, I think, a fantastic way of doing so, of achieving name branding. Like I said, public activism helps as well. Visegrad has a good track record. I'll say again to my students, they're interested in hard politics. They're not interested in bicycle rides and picnics and poetry publications. But Visegrad does all of that and more. And these are ways of seeping into a public that would not necessarily be interested in diplomacy. So it makes the brand recognition stronger. Again, if that is a seeming priority. And the involvement of public personalities. Visegrad had a leading start with that, although ironically, I think that Visegrad, as an institutionalized set of relations, actually needed to dispense would be too hard, but to move away from strong historical personalities, as important, as respectable and credible as they are, to regularized patterns of interaction. So a combination of big personality and patterns of activity. And talking about patterns of activity and personalities, I would also say, looking over the long history now of Visegrad, don't worry about political leaderships. Political leadership has often been a difficulty for Visegrad. Again, not as a diplomat, I can speak very, very bluntly. In the early days of Visegrad, some of the doubts about it were such that some of the seeming key characters in it didn't even stay around for press conferences. But in later guises, they became tremendous supporters of Visegrad. So there's not a constant practice among individuals. And then being very specific again, a reason that Visegrad suffered tremendously in the 1990s was that two political personalities really targeted it for destruction. One, the Premier of Slovakia, Vladimir Mečiar, the second, Václav Klaus, in the Czech Republic. And it's really quite striking to see that in presidency reports, Visegrad presidency reports, written years after Klaus's prime ministership or presidency, there is still comment about how Klaus and his policies sought to denigrate and even break Visegrad. However, you will get some more pictures later, but a picture now. I include this because we see the same Václav Klaus, who said that Visegrad was a false creation of the West, that was something that the Czechs did not need, jokingly referred to it as the National Cemetery. Of course, same sounding place name, but written differently. Here is Klaus years on, attending the highest level meetings of V4, hand in hand with friends. So again, no need to worry, and additionally, no need to worry if you have what I would call do-it-yourself institutionalizations. So I've already hinted at the idea that Visegrad, and I think proudly says, that it has no institution except for the IVF. And in terms of building, in terms of mortar, yes, that's true. But as something of an observer, and I've had the opportunity in particular years to visit all national coordinators, one after the other in the 4 countries, and to get a sense of their interactions among each other. This is a cooperation that is, I think, extremely institutionalized, but in a cost-effective and very flexible and efficient way. These are great takeaways, I think, from Visegrad. So those involved in Visegrad policy in foreign ministries told me that they were in constant touch with each other, that they didn't need a secretariat, that they and their staffs, they're not alone, were in absolutely regular contact with their counterparts. So in that sense, the communications, the channels are absolutely established. We've already said that there's interministerial cooperation. Virtually every ministry, not just foreign, every ministry in all 4 countries deals with Visegrad topics. So we have institutionalization that way. But in addition, if one looks at the presidency programs, especially over time, these are remarkable documents. They grew from a very few paragraphs once they started to multi-page documents, 10s, 20s, usually 30, 40 pages, with policy initiatives for the rotating presidencies. And of course, rotating presidencies is an institution in itself. And then the annual reports, again, sometimes running into the high tens of pages of report, and then pages and pages. Sometimes, I've actually done this, I enjoy other things as well, but I've counted up the number of recorded meetings held every year by Visegrad. These run into the hundreds. So for Visegrad to tell us that it's not institutionalized is, in the nicest way, slightly misleading. Again, I think it is institutionalized, and in a cost-effective and very, very efficient way. So one consideration is do-it-yourself institutionalization. And I would also suggest, in its history, Visegrad has had some crises. About 16 years ago, there was something of a crisis when a lesser-known premier in Hungary wanted to have the Beneš decrees repealed. I'm sure everybody in a room like this knows the Beneš decrees, but these were the orders sanctified by the Big Three at the end of the Second World War to allow the expulsion of Germans and Hungarians from Czechoslovakia. And the Hungarian government wanted the Beneš decrees repealed before the Czech and Slovak republics entered the EU in about a year's time after that. And in protest, so Visegrad became a platform for protest, the Czech and Slovak premiers pulled out of a prime ministerial meeting. So protest on the one hand, but continued activity, indeed institutional activity on the other. While that highest level protest was occurring against Hungary, all 4 Visegrad ministers of culture met, and ironically in Budapest. So it's multi-level as well. Don't worry about unequal size, or don't worry too much. If one does an historiographic treatment, and you can by now because there is so much literature, almost constant talk about big Poland. And of course, it is big. It's by population almost 4 times the demographic size of the Czech Republic or Hungary. That's a tremendous disparity. And of course, Poland sees itself as a major player, a significant player in the European Union, and has a number of foreign policy activities, including ones that have been at odds with other Visegrad countries. Nevertheless, fantastic evidence of Poland being a great supporter of Visegrad. And this leads us to one of our other considerations, that there is not a mutual exclusivity among foreign policy activities. If we go back very far, tremendous writings about the danger of the breakup of Czechoslovakia. Some of the most distinguished people in the literati, the dissident communities of the then Czechoslovakia, I'm thinking of Jan Urban, Petr Pithart, writing how the very breakup of Czechoslovakia would shatter the region, create two small countries that were vulnerable to the others, and in one case, even again, vulnerable to Poland. Does this sound preposterous now? I think it does. So it speaks to the fact that Visegrad, even though it has a tremendous range in bean counting terms of sizes of countries, actually has remarkable coherence among them. And of course, Slovakia, I think, has turned its relatively small size, it's by far the smallest, half the population of Hungary, the Czech Republic, into, I think, an advantage. Also backed, of course, by its central geographic location. Size doesn't need to matter. And indeed, part of the principle of multilateralism is usually sovereign egalitarianism, that countries are equal. I think Visegrad speaks to that. Cohesive versus cohesive and exclusive memberships. This is a tough one, especially if we think more widely across regional organizations. There is a propensity, I think, in regional organizations to expand membership. Membership means bigger, means better name recognition. So the Council of the Baltic Sea States extended itself, if we can think of the Baltic Sea now, extended itself all the way to Norway. I know we have Norwegian representation here, and I've already said I love Norway. I have been told by the Secretariat of the Council of the Baltic Sea States why they wanted Norway in, and the Council of the Baltic Sea States stretches even to Iceland, out in the Atlantic. Extend your membership as far as possible. There may be reasons for it. Does this create cohesiveness? Russia is in the Council of the Baltic Sea States. And when it was formed, when it created something of a first charter, it dealt with the fact of Russia, not by name, but by saying it was going to exclude security issues. So larger memberships can actually be extremely constraining. The Central European Initiative, which grew out of a localized initiative, actually of sub-state actors around the Danube, parts of Hungary, Yugoslavia, Austria, Italy, expanded to 18 countries, stretching across the EU, NATO, and including even Belarus. I would say, with respect to it, a lack of coherence, a lack of purpose. Larger membership is not necessarily good. Of the many organizations that have emerged across the post-communist space, Visegrad is the only one that has never expanded membership. Putting aside, of course, the entry of the Czech and Slovak republics as successor states in January 1993. It's never expanded membership, and I think that's actually spoken extremely well to the success of Visegrad. Some of the effect of that has been to create both envy and attraction. It could be the same thing, flip sides. In the 1990s, I traced how neighboring countries, particularly Bulgaria, Romania, Slovenia, to an extent Croatia, Ukraine, envied the Visegrad activities, envied Visegrad's resonance with Western interlocutors, again, especially the European Community, European Union, and NATO. So exclusion had some downsides of envy. There's really quite striking statements made, including by other heads of state, saying that they, if their countries were inside Visegrad, it would be a marker of their success in their transformations. And also the need for Visegrad membership to achieve Euro-Atlantic accession. Of course, in the end, that wasn't needed, and it wasn't done on a group basis, but it was this perception. So attraction, also envy from the exclusive membership. So there's a slight danger from that, but it's not necessarily a problem, and this comes to another attribute of Visegrad if you use inclusive formats. Most multilateral organizations, whether sectoral or political, specialized or more general, do look at others. They think of other partners. I think the OSCE is particularly good at its outreach. Its mantra essentially is, we'll speak to anyone. I would say, having done some work on the EU and in EU structures and with EU funding, goodness knows what will that mean after Brexit, to see actually that in many, many ways the EU can be limited in the engagement with partners. The V4 plus format, in a sense, a very simple idea. V4 plus is now an established practice where other parties are clicked on to V4 activism, or in some ways the V4 clicks itself on to others. So the plus have included countries as far away as in East Asia, the United States, certainly major European partners, other European formations like Brexit, Brexit, goodness, what a misspeak, Benelux, the Nordic, and so forth. So a very accessible way of engaging with other countries on an issue-specific activity. So there's a ready basis for working, and indeed for success. I think this is a very good way of doing it. And it retains recognition, because it's Visegrad, even if it's a respondent, seeming to be the initiator and the organizer. Multilateral organizations have to push back. Visegrad, as a testament to its importance, has had attacks from other parties. One of the most striking, it may now seem quite a while back, was from French President Nicolas Sarkozy, who basically castigated Visegrad for seeming to take prepared positions in European Council meetings. And Visegrad had, I think, a very astute, I was very proud of them, can I put it that way, a very astute response. Visegrad said, France and Germany coordinate before European Council meetings, why shouldn't we? By us coordinating, we actually help the Council, we save time, we bring a cohesive position, and we also ideally bring workable ideas to you, and essentially that it's good for the Council, and that we have a right to do it. So pushback where need be. As I say, Visegrad virtues regarding European Council meetings, but then there's a question of how you be measured in the values that you do. This is, after all, diplomacy, and more than me, many of you here are going to be tremendously skilled in getting the right balance in an open, effective, likable way of trying to assert interests. So Visegrad has to do that. And one of the striking things for me, looking almost at the totality of what's been said, what's been written about Visegrad over such a long period of time, is the assumption that it's actually not functioned for a very long time. And that is because it became most known internationally in 2015. This is a misnomer because the group, of course, existed. The group was very important in Euro-Atlantic accession, we've established that, and in doing various pushbacks, asserting its interests in the European Union. I know we'll have a whole session hereafter on the EU and Visegrad, but let's remember that there were EU member states that wanted to delay Schengen for the Visegrad countries, and Visegrad was successful in pushing that back. Visegrad has been successful on some major issues, including energy security, in infrastructural issues, including some of the reverse flows now that reduce the dependency on hydrocarbons from a large country further east. So there's a lot of activism that can happen, and that is often missed. And it's particularly missed now with a retrospective starting date, an incorrect one, but a retrospective starting date, seemingly for Visegrad in 2015. And that is on values. So this will be the second last thing to which I speak. To get the most name recognition from contesting values. This is perhaps a very, very dicey subject. Of course, we're talking about the so-called migrant crisis. For others, it could be a refugee crisis. Here, Visegrad put out common policies in the European Union, took a number of different tactics to underline those positions, including whether it would boycott meetings, get it itself excluded from meetings, and then very physical activities. For me, when I had the honor of coming here for one of the anniversaries, earlier there was a photo display of Visegrad's history, and in that photo display were images similar to these, the four-way border patrol that Visegrad put together. So a Hungarian, Slovak, Polish, and Czech officer in common uniform with common badges, patrolling Hungary's southern border, common badges there. And perhaps Hungary being the most outspoken on this, as Visegrad adopting policies that were responsible towards an otherwise irresponsible Europe. And that this is actually major contributions to Europe. So stands can come from certainly controversial views, but I think Visegrad has, whatever one makes of this policy initiative, stood a very strong ground. And again, its strongest recognition arguably comes from a reversal of its original starting point. And that starting point was also the commonality of European values, that Visegrad was representing a return to Europe, of being the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and so on, the fundamental values that made Europe Europe. And one that was to be open, moving taking down the boundaries that were then the EC and NATO. And Visegrad, again, was very successful in that. To a position now which seems one of actually putting up boundaries and making resistance. That's something we might debate. As a last point, so I am coming to a close, and we will, I'd be very, very interested on feedback. Some thoughts about how you make a regional cooperation, including how you put yourself out there, how you, in a crowded field, make a name for yourself, give yourself specific identity. That means history, and that means being creative about history. And to me, that means making good myths. History is full of myths. You're hearing a Canadian, not an American accent, but one of my favorite myths is Thanksgiving. Has anybody experienced American Thanksgiving? Some of you? Okay. This is, would you agree, it's highly inclusive. It's not in any way religious. It's meant for every American, and anybody joins in. We adopted it in Canada. Of course, the origins of the Thanksgiving celebration were the original pilgrims with indigenous Americans. That doesn't apply to Canada. But we used it because it is a good, inclusive myth. Visegrad seized on what I would call myth. Its very name. Very lucky, because this is a Slavic-sounding word, Visegrad, which is found in non-Slavic, Finno-Ugric Hungary. So immediately pronounceable across the 3 and then 4 countries. The picture on the right, a bit of redundancy, but hopefully for a point. The picture on the right is from the Visegrad Group website of the Visegrad Castle. That's one I took myself, just for verification. And why have I done that? This is all about myth-making, but positive myth-making. The actual Visegrad meeting was held in another Visegrad castle, the lower castle. And in fact, they were so unprepared for the meeting that the castle was freezing. There's a record of how they tried to find electric heaters to warm up the big chamber that was going to be used in, of course, February 1991. And here on the right, just to underscore that, it looks, I don't know about you, it looks a bit funereal to me, but these are wreaths that were put by the leaders of each Visegrad state commemorating that meeting, again, in the lower castle. So we even have the misuse of castle in making this great myth. And Visegrad was built on the idea of a medieval meeting in 1335, where the 3, not the 4, where the 3 kings, the precursor nations of the present ones, met. And we take this in the good history of Visegrad as a great meeting of minds and of great cooperation. Read it in historical context, and this summit was no different from any other. It was classic balance of power. They were meeting together to form an alliance against a threatening outside power. There were land exchanges. There was even effectively a forced marriage, payoffs, classic balance of power. However, put that aside. That's not 1991 or Visegrad of today. It's the resonance of historical reference. And here I'm going to segue away for a moment. And this is going to be slightly graphic. I said there are 2 Visegrad castles, and of course there are at least 2 Visegrads. The Visegrad that I've been speaking about, and the Visegrad just 500 kilometers away in Bosnia, one of the first cities to fall in the Yugoslav wars of succession. And also in the 14th century, another myth was used, that of 1389, the Battle of Kosovo Polje. So 2 Visegrads that were used in extremely different ways. One leading, very frankly, to mass murder, the other to a very positive cooperation. And I'm going to end on these pictures because there is absolute, don't be mistaken, I love Visegrad, there's absolute falsehood here, but it's good falsehood. And I think that's a great lesson for multilateralism. You have the flags of all 4 countries. The 4 were not present in 1335. The 4 were not present in 1991, but the flags are there. And we have wax figures in another castle recreating the feast of 1335. So falsified, but good history. But one that I think, and I hope the past few minutes have helped to suggest this, that have helped to make a very unlikely form of multilateralism, and one that has filled with different types of content, but that nonetheless, I think, gives us a good set of lessons for other multilateralism. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Professor Fawn for such informative and quite, I guess, constructive in many ways with all his recommendations presentation. I'm very curious how all 4 countries are going to respond to your talk in the special panel that is organized by my colleague Jakub Eberle after the coffee break, because I'm sure they observed and listened, and they will have a lot to say to your speech. I'll first ask the audience, because I don't want to use up my moderators' rights to ask questions, because we're here to have a debate. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question, please? Yes. Can you always please introduce yourself and what organization you're from?
Hello, my name is Tomasz Żonaczek. I'm from the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you very much for this lecture. It's very informative, and I think you noticed something that we often don't notice, although I myself come from a Visegrad country. You said also that this is the only organization that never changed its members. Well, being from Poland, I need to notice that there is a 3Cs initiative that is quite new and that our government is very proud of. Since you have such an in-depth knowledge about Visegrad, yet observing that from outside, would you please elaborate a little bit on that new format? What do you think about it, and do you think it overlaps or it's like a contesto to the Visegrad group? What do you think about that format? And thank you very much.
Do we want to gather questions or take them one at a time?
Sure. Do we have? There is one at the back, please.
Hello, my name is Pavel Havlicek. I'm working with the Association for International Affairs. Thank you very much, first of all, Rick, for being trying to be positive and constructive about Visegrad. Sometimes it's much more difficult to come from the region and be positive than if you look from outside. So thank you very much for that, first of all. I'm also trying to be positive about Visegrad itself, and you mentioned a couple of the points, related to Western Balkans, to Eastern Partnership. Nowadays, Czechia, where we are now, is having the presidency, so we are also trying with the association to advocate for some positive and constructive approach, especially when it comes to, for example, Eastern Partnership region. And but what you see in fact and in reality is that there are very often a complicated relationship you see between Hungary and Ukraine. You see all of these battles and so on and so forth. The same in previous years, especially from the Polish side, historical tensions about Wołyń and other historical debates, very painful ones. So how do you foresee this positive change or keeping the good image of Visegrad when we have so many of these problems? And I'm just trying to see the creative spirits and solutions that you can bring us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I think these are very, very challenging questions. And I think to the first, my starting answer would be that I'm interested in your views, and I try to read everything that is generated by think tanks. Here I'm a recipient of mailings from your institute. So I think it's really the region which will know a great deal on this. But my comments would be this. I think this is an example, with all respect to the initiative, it's an example of one of many that have appeared in the region. And at different times, we're told that this is the new format, that, for example, when there was a cooperation initiative started by Austria, that this was going to be the end of Visegrad. It was the other way around. The Austrian initiative, to my mind, did not continue, and Visegrad most certainly has. So I think there's an element of staying power that is significant with Visegrad. The answer I would give to that question is, can we look at this in 10 years' time? Does that type of format exist, and what has it done? So I would slightly be doubtful, but perhaps a more substantive answer is something that I was hoping to suggest already, and I perhaps didn't make it strongly enough, and that is that Visegrad, or indeed any multilateral organization, should be careful about what it chooses to take on. And I think Visegrad, and for anybody who needs help sleeping, I wrote an article in 2013 along these lines. Visegrad has a kind of tautological decision-making process. It's very clear about not taking on things where there isn't already a high degree of consensus. So their chances of success are better. And we should extrapolate from that also that organizations shouldn't try to solve everything. NATO, for all its funding, cannot do everything. So there are limits. But another thing that I was saying is that none of these formats need to work in mutually exclusive terms. And Visegrad, I think, is very good at engaging with others. So I will confess, I'm not giving a specific answer on this form of cooperation. To me, the answer would be, can we come back in 10 years and see what it's done? I mean, it could be the strongest. It could be the one that ASEAN, that the African Union wants to engage with, which would be a really telling statement. Or it might have been like quite a number that had a bit of fanfare and then fizzled out. So I'm not quite sure. And I'm not sure that it has an implication for Visegrad. If anything, I think Visegrad has ready-made mechanisms for engagement with it. So I hope that's helpful in some regards. And then many comments, much appreciated in yours. Perhaps I focus on the Hungarian-Ukrainian issue to begin with. And I think part of the answer to that is, or perhaps a significant answer to that, is not to do with Visegrad. Although what I have seen, and perhaps has concerned me somewhat, is a low-scale, or it seems to me, a low-scale use of Visegrad by Hungary to critique Ukrainian minority language rights. I mean, particularly to the west of Ukraine, where the Hungarian minority is located. When I first saw that starting, I thought that Visegrad might be mobilized more in that direction. Much in the way, allow me to say it, that Visegrad has been mobilized for other issues, namely the migrant one. But I don't think it's gotten to that level. What I was also, I'll put this on major media like The Economist. I mean, Hungary is being called, at best, a one-party state. There are people of great stature who are calling it simply authoritarian. This is a country that has, if you want, forward policies towards Russia. So I slightly wonder on the Hungarian-Ukrainian issue if this is not a way of even appeasing or aiding Russia. You know, by attacking Ukraine, once more delegitimizing its government and showing it to be a fairly intolerant country. So I think that there may be activities there that are separate from Visegrad, perhaps parallel to them. So, but if there's another question within what you asked, I'm very happy to address it. I'm not sure that I'm taking on all of the very valuable things that you said. So, yeah. And I'm interested to hear other perspectives on this. And what I don't know, maybe you could shed light on it, is whether the other countries tried to calm down that issue. I mean, I asked quite a bit in 2013, 2015 to those running Visegrad what policies, what activities they decide not to do. When they decide not to do things. And I also asked a lot of outsiders about what Visegrad could be doing. And a lot of those outsiders were saying, you know, acting on liberalism, protecting, for example, the Central European University, bastions of, shall we call it, liberalism, free thinking, and so on, and where Visegrad decided to step back. So it takes and that's perhaps understandable of a multilateral entity, it takes a step back on domestic issues as well. So this may be a category of a domestic issue, too.
Do we have more questions from the audience, please? What I find very, I guess, optimistic was that you said, I guess in your talk, that we are constructive in some ways, that there is a value, but we just don't know how to make our statements likable, you know. And just from my personal experience, because one of our special partners here today is the Think Visegrad think tank platform, and that's one of the frameworks that we use as researchers to draft papers that are then delivered to our ministries. And I have to say, I've been interacting with the group and different states over a year, and it's been very constructive, smooth, and very good decision making, and no loud voices. But then you said, don't look at the leaders, they'll pretty much change their jackets. Maybe today they're negative, then they will cooperate. But we have no control as research community amongst ourselves, even though we try to be constructive and give the positive voice over the leaders. You know, they are the ones who will then be called troublemakers and spin the name in a different direction. So I don't know how we can help to appease this kind of dynamics.
No, thank you, Alisa. I think that it's a very opposite, very important question. When I was saying about leaderships, I mean, of course they're extremely important. They have the resources, they have the platforms, they have the policies. No question about that. But they are not necessarily enduring. And we can see tremendous fluctuations in Vishegrad's direction over time. So the first thing I would say is, and it's not necessarily that helpful, but is to say that the current situation need not be the future. And leaders, I mean, they do change their jackets. That's why particularly, I'll say it, picked on Klaus. I mean, there was a fantastic role reversal, particularly on Visegrad. I mean, this is somebody who is noted in subsequent Visegrad documents as somebody who wanted to destroy the organization, who then turned around and became a supporter of it. So there are prospects of hope. What I think concerns me more is, and it's just too big a topic for now, is and I'd also say I do not like the term populism, because populism sounds to me at least as having a legitimating element to it. You know, the population matters, right? The demos matters. But what we're calling this turn towards populism. So I think there are trends that are emanating from the region. Central Europe is a contributor that way, but there are wider trends that I think we need to confront. So my suggestions would be, first, keep doing what you're doing. Second, do the dissemination that you're doing. I mean, I think Central Europe reaches a lot of people. People who I know not to be engaging in Central Europe are knowing about things that are happening here. You have very good reach to noted journalists in the West. There's an awful lot of, I would call it sympathy, to the changes that are happening in the region. There are very, very established, recognized individuals who are not happy with it, who have a lot of say in the West, and you are the interlocutors for them. There is some, I think there's also rotation. I'm impressed here in Central Europe having, I mean, the Ustav Mezinárodních vztahů gave me a very warm welcome a very long time ago as a graduate student in the 1990s. I have seen the rotation between think tankers, academics, and your ministries. I would even say it's more pronounced, it's more developed here, get ready for this, than in Britain, than in Canada, possibly in the United States. So there can be a more subtle way of doing it through the mechanisms of the ministries. Now, of course, if you have a minister, if you have a prime minister or president who says something, that's one thing. But I think that the corpus is important. And you have that possibility, I think, of putting lifeblood into the system. So you're asking this because it's a very good and very tough question. So I can't give you a magic answer. It wouldn't have that. But those are some of my thoughts. So they are, those thoughts are keep doing what you're doing.
I need to thank you for your presentation and your comments, because we're out of time right now, but I would like to ask for a kind applause. And
okay, thank you for having me.
I invite everyone to a very quick 10-minute coffee, and then we'll have a big V4 discussion in this great hall, but we also have an Asia roundtable in one of the halls. And I believe we've got EU policies in Central Europe and European states as part of the Mezinárodní vztahy, or Czech Journal of International Relations workshop at the same time. So it's from 10:45 to 12:30 based on your programs. I guess whatever suits your expertise. So we start 10:45. Thank you.